building a robust national regulatory framework for online gaming. Now, with high growth comes great responsibility, because the next session will have in the industry discussing the focus on creating safe, trusted and accountable gaming environment. And we're going to do that in the form of a beautiful panel discussion. And let me tell you that we've been managing to break boundaries ever since we've also gone virtual. So we've got two of our speakers harnessing the power of technology to share their thoughts. But first up, let me please invite our session moderator. We have with us Sameer Chugh, General Counsel, Games 24/7. So if I could please invite Sameer to please come on stage. Our next speaker, if I could please invite Bhavit, Sheth, COO and co-founder, Dream Sports. May I also once again please invite Dr. Trivikraman, Thampy, who is the CEO and co-founder Games 24/7, to please come on stage. And joining us virtually, we have with us Jean Major, President, JLM Consulting. And we also have with us Sarah Ramanauskas, co-founder of the Game Safety Institute. So I'd like to also extend a warm welcome to Jean and Sarah, who are joining us virtually. Thank you, Sameer. And I'm going to quickly hand over the proceedings to you. And a warm welcome once again to Jean and Sarah as well. With that, Sameer, over to you then.
Second session after lunch. I hope people are not sleepy, because be prepared for some very interesting conversation during this session. We have two excellent speakers on the panelists on the virtual thing as well. So let me just not waste time and introduce the panelists here. So I'll start with Trivikraman Thampy, fondly called as Vikram, and he's the co-founder and CEO of Games 24/7. Vikram has a bachelor's, or rather aerospace engineering from IIT Bombay, and is a PhD in economics from NYU. Bhavit Seth, he's the COO and co-founder of Dream Sports, India's leading sports technology company, with over 200 million users and brands such as Dream 11, FanCode, Dream Set Go, Dream Game Studios, So Strong, and it continues. On the virtual, we have Sarah Ramanauskas, who is a leading figure in responsible gaming. She advises the gaming industry and its regulators worldwide, and has recently launched the Game Safety Institute. The institute aims to develop and disseminate global research and thought leadership at the intersection of gaming platforms, games, and player safety. And then we also have Jean Major. Mr. Major has been a regulator of the gaming industry for over 30 years in Ontario, Canada. He has led the development and implementation of modern, flexible regulatory framework for the industry that supports a competitive market with the highest standards of honesty, integrity, and player protection. Mr. Major retired as CEO of the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario in 2020, and now provides consultancy services on regulatory strategy and policy. So be prepared for a lot of regulatory, kind of inputs or on how the regulation looks at, or it should look at as well. I think some best practices from the world over. And so let me just start straight away. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us on the panel. Maybe, I'm going to throw this question. Maybe before that, I should just give you a bit of a, kind of situation here, or a status. I mean, regulatory framework of the online gaming industry, as we've been hearing all morning. The IT rules got amended. I mean, the regulations are in place. Of course, there is more to be done. And clearly, the better the regulations, the more the regulations, I think the better the industry will be. And if you were to see that, I think we have experts here who can tell us what else can be done, what is good, and what more can be done really. So maybe I'll just start straight off with a question to and I'll request first Sarah to go ahead and followed by John. Saying basically what does player protection mean? And what is the importance of the same? Because ultimately the players or the users are at the heart of online gaming. And if they are not protected, then who else is? And therefore, if they are, so is the online gaming industry. So I'm going to then turn around and kind of just move to Sarah and John. Sarah, do you want to go ahead and welcome to the panel? Sarah, we can't hear you. Sorry, can somebody?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me to this really important gathering. It's a deep pleasure and honor to be here. So thank you, Samir, for the question. What is player protection? I've spent the last probably 8 or 9 years working in this space, so 4 minutes is not very much time for me to give you all of my ideas and recommendations, and I know Jean has lots to add as well. So very quickly, an overview is that player protection really is a partnership. It's a partnership between the player, the operator, and the regulator. And on all sides, the most important things are insight into player behavior. And that is where you in the online gaming space have a huge opportunity to really make the most of the information that you have about players. So it's about insight from the operators. It's about sensible regulation from the regulators in partnership with the operator. So, for example, in the UK, the Gambling Commission here has only just set up a unit which is an industry body to advise them, which I think has taken far too long and should have been done ages ago. The regulator needs to be in partnership with the operator. In addition to that, the operator needs to really understand their players, what they need, how they behave, and the best way to encourage them to play in a way that is perfect for them, that is not risky, that is entertaining, and that doesn't get them into trouble. And I think regulation supported by good understanding from the player's perspective, good understanding from the operators, is a way to ensure that really the Indian gaming industry can stay ahead of some of the mistakes perhaps that have been made around the rest of the world. You know, you have a fantastic opportunity to learn from what has been done elsewhere, and to really build something that the rest of the world can look to as best practice. Jean, what would you add?
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much as well for inviting me to this session. Sarah's quite right with respect to the concept of partnerships. I speak as a long-time regulator, and the concept of partnership is actually extremely important, particularly in the field of player protection. There is a good reason, or many reasons, why gaming in general is very highly regulated around the world. It is important to maintain player confidence, consumer confidence in gaming to ensure that they are held to the highest standards of honesty and integrity and social responsibility. Now, the phrase player protection, in my view, is extremely important. In fact, responsible gaming or player protection and anti-money laundering, I would argue, would be the two most critical issues that any jurisdiction should look at. In fact, player protection was a pivotal factor in the jurisdiction from where I am in Ontario, Canada, for the government to regulate online gaming about 2 years ago. So from a regulatory perspective, if someone was to ask me what are the benefits of regulating online gaming, from a player protection perspective, I would argue there were 4 pillars. Ensuring that the games that are offered have been independently tested and that they are fair and transparent to the players, that there is timely and accurate payout of winnings, that personal information and data are secure, and of course, that there are appropriate policies and procedures and safeguards, as Sarah just mentioned, that will identify, prevent, and minimize harm or risk of harms from gaming to players. In Ontario, the approach to doing that, and there's, as Sarah said, it's you can't do it justice in 4 minutes. The approach to dealing with those issues is complex. In Ontario, we moved away from a very prescriptive approach to dealing with player protection issues to a more outcomes-based approach to regulation. So as a brief example, an example of a player protection standard would be on advertising and marketing. Um, Advertising marketing should not target or high risk, underage, or self excluded individuals. And it would be up to the operator to identify internal controls to address that particular standard or that particular outcome. In Ontario, you would also have particular requirements that the operator would have to follow. For example, any communication to players should not be targeted to or contain references to entertainers or to celebrities that would appeal to underage individuals, for as an example. And if the operator doesn't meet those particular standards, then there would be consequences or sanctions to that particular operator. So that's a very broad area in terms of the approach to it, in terms of standards, and what player protection means from the jurisdiction where I come from.
Thank you. And I'm going to just, request Vikram and Bhavit to just, step in and really say, because player protection ultimately, as I was saying, that the gaming industry is because of players. So, I mean, what, from a business standpoint, how do you see player protection?
Sure, I think, Sarah actually brought up a good point on player protection, and the way we think about it is the player, it's the operator, and it's the regulator as well, right? And here, in the absence of a regulator, we've been adopting the best practices that we believe are gold standard. And when the regulator comes in, I think all of us from the start of the day have been talking about regulations, right? So when the regulations come in, we are more than happy to work with the regulator to up the game and to work with them to understand what their expectation is from player protection. So we can make sure that there's a standard that's set, and then everyone follows that standard, and then there's no scope of interpretation, certain people not doing things the right way, a lot of operators doing things the right way, and then the government not knowing what to do, because there's no set guidelines. So once that guidelines come in for player protection, it'll be easier to put a set standard for operators as well to then standardize player protection.
Vikram?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the points have already been made. I'll just add that I think most companies want to do the right thing. They want to take care of their players. They want to operate responsibly. But different companies are at different stages of their life cycle and have many stakeholders that they need to respond to. And this is where I think a regulator can play an immensely important role, where a lot of the work, so for instance, and I'm sure other federations have done this too, the e-gaming federation did a lot of work working with regulators outside of India to come up with a comprehensive code of conduct, but that requires work, right? And if you're a startup and coming up with some creative ideas, want to build great games, like you cannot spend, weeks, months, trying to figure out what is the right responsible gaming practices to put in. And this is where I think a regulator can add a lot of value and lay down a code of conduct or ethics, whether they are prescriptive or outcome-based, that will guide all of us in terms of what is something common, as Bhavit just mentioned, that all of us are required to do to protect players.
No, thank you. And I think that gets to a very important piece, because, again, what best practices are being followed across the globe are going to be very important. And I think it's important that if there is a learning out there, we should take it. And I'm going to go back to Sarah first and request, if you could share some of the best practices that are there globally or in other parts of the world that we could take here in India around responsible gaming and advertising.
Thank you again, Samir. I was asked to discuss this question, and I thought about it and thought, actually, I'm not sure that the gaming industry worldwide is really doing very much in terms of best practice. So what I'm now doing actually in the UK often is looking to financial services for best practice when thinking about how to communicate with players. But generally, so if you're thinking about responsible marketing, what is that? And I think comes to three key points. What is the message? Where's the message? And who is it for? So in terms of what is the message, responsible gaming marketing must be clear, fair, and transparent. And again, a kind of a not best practice example would be from the States, where DraftKings used a risk-free bet advertisement for some time until that was basically regulated out of existence, because I'm sure I don't have to tell you, the audience, which I'm looking at now, there's really no such thing as a risk-free bet. So the message itself, if you want to market responsibly, it needs to be very clear, simple, transparent, and fair, as we've already discussed. There needs to be integrity, there needs to be fairness. Where should that message be? And Jean has already touched on this. You need to be very clear about who you are targeting. Who do I want to see this message? And this kind of comes into also, who is that message for, and where do I put it? So from Jean's perspective, Canada has got great regulations. From my perspective, I have Canadian in-laws, and every time I go to Canada, I get an earful because my mother-in-law goes, "Why is there so much gambling advertising? What are you going to do about it?" So I think, the Indian gaming industry really needs to be certain that when these regulations come in, they are conscious of the fact that saturation could be an issue. Responsible marketing is about giving clear and fair messages to the right people at the right time and not having saturation, because that just creates a backlash. I can't tell you, because I don't know enough about the Indian media world to say what saturation might look like. All I can advise is that you apply the mother-in-law test. Your mother-in-law presumably doesn't play fantasy sports, but if she starts complaining to you about the amount of gaming advertising she's seeing, you've probably reached a saturation point and you are wasting your marketing dollars. So responsible marketing, clear, fair, transparent, to the right people at the right time, and not too much of it.
Thank you, Sarah. John, I'm going to just ask you if you have anything that you want to add from a Canadian perspective.
Yeah, Sarah touched on a very sensitive nerve on the abundance of marketing and advertising in Canada, and Ontario in particular. Since, of course, I'm not sitting in the chair as a regulator at the moment when this was permitted, but Sarah is quite correct. There's been quite a bit of reaction to the amount of marketing and advertising of online gaming in Canada, in Ontario in particular, when it was legalized. And the regulator is pushed in a fairly awkward position between the desire to have a competitive marketplace and have a balanced approach to the consumer from a player protection perspective. And so there have been some restrictions in advertising and marketing, not so much on the quantum, but rather on the focus of the marketing that has been somewhat controversial in Ontario, whereby sports celebrities, for example, current or past celebrities could not be used to promote online gaming. And so this is a work in progress for Ontario. I don't know that we have landed on the solution at this point. We look very often to the UK because of their much more advanced, I think, in experience in this area in terms of looking at how these issues are managed. But it is an issue that you need to be mindful of, because once the train is out of the gate, it is difficult to bring back. It's not uncontrollable, but it is a public policy question with respect to an open market principle that is properly regulated, and then how you control that open market. That is a difficult balance to consider.
Thank you, John. I'm going to change gears here and really get into a very important topic, which I think is something that I believe is very important for the government, important for us as companies. And therefore, I'm going to, kind of go back to Vikram and Bhavit here, saying there is a lot of questions around money laundering and, the whole AML practice, etc. Now, from a business perspective, how do you guys see it? And I think, kind of, we have the benefit of the two CEOs here sitting and, kind of, how do you see it? Is that something that keeps you awake? What do you think can be done?
I mean, I think a lot of the operators are already doing most of the stuff that you should be doing to prevent money laundering. One is full KYC of a customer. So I think if you are on the Google Play Store now, Google Play Store, even without regulations in place, requires you to do KYC of a customer before you take a deposit. And the second is the source of money. And I think most operators sitting around here, the source of money is, I mean, we talked about the whole digital revolution in India and UPI, and I think almost all the funds that gaming companies receive are through UPI and directly from bank accounts. So, but again, some of these practices need to be standardized, across operators, across businesses, across games. And then the last piece is obviously one part is the money coming in, and the second part is the money going out. And just in terms of making sure that, there is correlation and significant and ideally identical between where the money came in from and where it's going back to. So I think, most operators do a lot of this stuff, but it's not encoded. And so, I think, again, from a regulatory perspective for the government to come out and lay down clear requirements on exactly what needs to be done at every stage of a financial transaction between an operator and a player would be immensely helpful and prevent the kind of, scandals that we have seen with money laundering recently in the Indian ecosystem.
Samir, I would just add, you're absolutely right that there is a concern that the government has. I believe the concern is also because there is operators who are doing things the right way, and then there are people who are at the border and, trying to do things which are not very kosher. So, and today, because there's no way and there's no certification as such of what is permissible, non-permissible, it's difficult for the government also to regulate or to even identify that, okay, this is something that I should go after because this is not okay. And when, the government starts certifying that, okay, this is fine and this is not okay, there'll be a clear demarcation that, oh, these are operators that do things the right way, and that's why they've been certified. They take money through RBI regulated banking channels, no cash involved, do KYC the right way, have the right kind of data models to catch something suspicious and report it. And then there are operators who would be doing things just for growth, for different reasons. And then those are the ones that should be weeded out, and that's how the concern actually can get stemmed at the root, rather than letting these operators grow large and then trying to actually figure out how to stop that.
Yeah, I want to add one thing, Samir, that I think this will also help, to Bhavit's point, like even law enforcement does not really know who and how to act against, because if the rules are not clear of what's okay and what's not, it also makes it harder for law enforcement to go after potentially rogue operators, who are either engaging, facilitating, money laundering. So even from that perspective, I think getting regulatory clarity will be hugely helpful for the industry.
So I think, I mean, the main key here is clarity and communication. So obviously there needs to be clarity, and it needs to be communicated so that all the stakeholders understand what ought to be done and be there. So I'm going to request both Sarah and John if they want to add anything on this piece of how they see it happening in other places. Maybe in a minute each, that'd be great. Do you want to go first, Sarah?
I'll hand over to Sean.
Okay.
I've been involved in several transition, if I could put it this way, of industries that went from unregulated to regulated. And the latest one was the online gaming operators. And what the operators, the vast majority of them today, and this has been going on for 20 years, at least 20 years in Canada, where operators have been operating in what we call in Canada a gray zone, which basically means we're operating offside law, but there's no enforcement of it. And there's been a consolidation of operators, and the sophistication of the operators is significantly different today than it was 20 years ago. And the vast majority of operators want to comply with the law, and they want to be on the right side of the law. And what they're looking for is consistency and a uniform basis, which everyone understands what the rules are, and they will comply with the rules. Now, I said at the outset that player protection was probably the pivotal public policy reason why Canada, or Ontario in particular, decided to regulate private operators at online gaming at the request, mind you, of the online operators. They wanted to be regulated. They wanted a level playing field. But an issue like AML is of equal importance because it has huge reputational issues, not only for the operators, but for the government and the jurisdiction in question. So it has to be taken seriously. But like everything else in gaming, having the rules in place is the easy part. Enforcing it, whether it's player protection or AML, is extremely important. And this is where the rubber hits the road, because it deals with profit issues and money issues. When you refuse a high roller from playing because there may be an issue with respect to problem gambling, that affects profitability. Same thing with AML. You need to be able to have a strong regulatory regime that is enforceable, that is balanced between these public policy objectives of player protection and anti-money laundering and other factors, as well as the competitive marketplace that you're trying to accomplish. But the overwhelming message from the operators that we heard was, we want a set of rules that we all agree to that will apply to everyone. And that's extremely important, and that forms the basis. So otherwise, most players in Ontario, I would argue, when they were operating in this gray area for the last 20 odd years, did not know that the sites that they were operating on were regulated or not regulated. And it was, quite frankly, the wild, wild west until now, where we have, I would argue, about 85% of the players playing on sites that are regulated, that play by one set of rules. But again, it is extremely important to have a regulator that's there to make sure that those rules are adhered to.
Thank you, John. I think that gets me to a point where we want regulations, absolutely. We understand the importance of regulations. So I'm going to really come back and kind of really ask the two CEOs here, what is your expectation of an ideal regulation? What do you think it needs to cover? We've talked about some of the things. What else do you think needs to be put in there? What else can be the progressive regulation which takes the industry forward?
See, I think from a regulation perspective, there are basic things like, what are the KYC norms that should be there? What is the advertising guidelines? And today, ASCII already has a code of advertising guidelines, Is that what we want to stick with? Is there something else we want to do out there? Then there's, from a player protection perspective, what kind of levers should the players have, from, setting limits to self-exclusion? So, these are the standard things. What's important is for the government and the operators to sit across the table. And I think the government has done a great job so far of hosting roundtables and, actually listening to the operator point of view as well. And for the operators also to understand what is the government's concern and how do we resolve that in a way where we are not making it too restrictive for players, but at the same time we are making sure that we are putting enough guardrails and enough protection to ensure that players don't, the player harm piece is sorted. And then once we have that in place, I think we spoke about innovation earlier in the day. There's a lot of scope of innovation out here also, the way we do KYC, for example. And today, gaming operators don't have the same ability to do KYC as a fintech, for example, because there's certain KYC data available only to regulated entities, and unregulated entities don't have access to that data. So once we start moving towards a more regulated environment and access to the right kind of data, how do we innovate to make sure that we are making sure whatever needs to be done for player protection is done in the right manner, and we are moving forward, ensuring the right guardrails are in place and the players are playing in a safe environment. Vikram?
Yeah, so, I think, the online gaming rules that were published by MeitY, from the perspective of just covering everything that matters, and that was the main purpose of those goals, and then they were to be further elaborated upon by the SRBs. I think those rules are, from a scope perspective, pretty comprehensive in terms of what's required. I think there was an awesome first step in terms of what would constitute good regulations, and I think Bhavit has talked a lot about that. And I think one thing that's an added thing in the Indian context particularly, for multiple reasons, the whole, whether you'd say betting, gambling versus, legal game, real money games. I think even there, the scope was well laid out with the idea of permissible online games, the idea of permissible online games carrying a registration mark, and I think that would solve a lot of the problems that we are facing today. Like if any legitimate app was required to carry a registration mark and over time you could build consumer awareness around that, then consumers know which apps are safe to play and which aren't, And that just doesn't exist today. And that unfortunately also limits operator side creativity in terms of what games you can launch, what games you cannot launch. It also restricts distribution because, Google Play is the biggest distributor for apps in India, and even they don't have clarity on what games are okay and what games are not. So I think, that would be a huge part of any regulatory structure as far as I'm concerned, which is just providing clarity on which games are allowed, which are not, and then having them carry a registration mark, which not just helps consumers, but also suppliers, whether it be distributors like Google Play or AWS or banks and payment services. All of them then have to ensure that you are carrying this registration mark, otherwise we can't do business with you. And that itself, I think, is going to help clean up a lot of the ecosystem.
No, absolutely. I think I'm going to just request both John and Sarah if you have anything to add, and then in the end I have something that I'll kind of also add in.
So I think, again, thank you all very much. And I just wanted to say, to wrap up, one thing, which is that you as the operators, you have lots of very smart specialist people. The regulators generally are, they're generalists, they're civil servants. They don't have your expertise. If you're going to have good regulation, then there needs to be this partnership where your clever specialist people in marketing, SEO, product development need to have that expertise reflected in the way in which those regulations are brought to bear.
John?
Yeah, well, as I was listening to the two CEOs discussing their case, the conversation was very familiar because I've heard that conversation for the last 15 to 20 years of my life about the need for regulation. So it's you're not alone. Let me put it that way. And I've heard you say not so many words, perhaps, but the balance. And Sarah just emphasized the point I was going to make. A regulator, they're there to ensure that the law is complied with. And so the law is made by Parliament, is made by politicians, and the regulator has a significant amount of discretion in how that law is actually enforced. It can best do so as a regulator with the input from a variety of the people that have an interest in the industry. That includes the business, that includes the players, it includes expertise from organizations that Sarah works for. And because most legislation, gaming, have a phrase saying that the law is to be applied in the public interest. And I've often been asked about what that phrase means. What is in the public interest? And to me, it is contextual. And however it is framed has to fit the jurisdiction. And so in Ontario, for example, we looked around the world for best practices in a variety of means in terms of understanding how to find that appropriate balance of what constitutes the public interest. It includes economic interests. It includes the player interests. It includes the social welfare interests. It includes the government's interests. And the regulator's responsibility is to balance all of those interests. And those will vary. I can tell you that from my perspective in 1992, when the first casino was opened in Ontario, that the public interest at that point was very different than what it is today. So it will fluctuate because public opinions vary, social, political, economic factors vary, and the regulator has to shift and pivot to meet those various interests. So it is very much about balance, but it does also mean it's also very much about what Sarah just mentioned about collaboration in the development of a framework that makes sense for the people of India, in your case, and for the industry that you're attempting to regulate.
Thank you. So, I mean, to sum it up, basically, we want clear regulations which are enforceable, followable, or rather, in a way which can be turned around and help in player protection, turn around and grow the industry. It does not stifle innovation, and clearly something that'll be good for the future. So, thank you very much to all the panelists. You've been wonderful, and thank you for all your thoughts here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was a bit up on the time.
Thank you indeed to our speakers. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jean. Thank you for joining in. And I'm going to be requesting our speakers here to also come together for a group photograph. Thank you once again. We managed to gather some really crisp and structured thoughts. Thank you, Samir, for beautifully spearheading that session for us.